I don't think it would be any exaggeration for me to say that Back 4 Blood has for a while now been one of the most anticipated games to release this year, save only for maybe New World. Everyone, myself included, has long heard that the developer, Turtle Rock Studios, has been working on some new IP for years now, and all signs indicated that they would be making a return to the genre that first gained them the popularity and pedigree which they initially had. I say initially because I think anyone would probably agree that Turtle Rock in the past few years has experienced somewhat of a PR nosedive following the release of their last AAA game, Evolve, later rechristened to Evolve Stage 2. While one could argue most of the game's faults, and by extension the blame, should instead be attributed to Evolve's publisher, one fact that is not in dispute is that the game ultimately proved to be a very high-profile public failure, one which left a notable stain on Turtle Rock's once spotless reputation. So, Turtle Rock made the obvious decision to abandon any future game experimentation and instead go back to what they were previously known for: cooperative multiplayer zombie FPS games. Industry rumors suggested that at some point Turtle Rock reached out to Valve to pitch some form of return to the Left 4 Dead series, but Valve's, at the time, disinterest in committing to the endeavor forced Turtle Rock to strike out on their own. Assuming this was indeed the case, I don't think it would be an unreasonable logical leap to theorize that Back 4 Blood's title was likely just as much of a middle finger to Valve as it was a banner for Left 4 Dead fans to rally behind. In the time leading up to release, and even following the game's release, both Turtle Rock and their new publisher, Warner Bros. Interactive, have not by any means been subtle in marketing this game as the natural successor to the Left 4 Dead series, which raises an important question relevant to today's discussion. Is Back 4 Blood, at its core, innovative or iterative, given its shared DNA with Left 4 Dead? Arguably the most talked about gameplay mechanic which distinguishes Back 4 Blood from Turtle Rock's previous endeavors is the card system. So let's get this out of the way. At the beginning of every round, several cards are drawn by both sides, on one hand being the player and another being the AI director itself, and we'll get to the AI director later. The player's cards all grant some kind of positive, active, or passive ability or trait, whereas the AI director will draw cards that present some additional objectives, hazards, or buffs to the zombie AI, making your experience harder in varied but consistently unpleasant ways. In addition, over time, players can collect cards either hidden in random locations in the levels, or by buying them from NPCs via the in-game hub, and in that hub are able to form their own card decks using said cards. We'll get to more specifics on that again later, but believe me, I have a lot to say when it comes to the card system in Back 4 Blood. Back 4 Blood is divided into 4 consecutive campaigns, which are designed to be exclusively experienced in a linear progression. If you're one of those people who just want to play through your favorite specific levels in some kind of user-generated playlist, or perhaps in a completely randomized order, I'm afraid you can't do that. Considering this game very openly marketed itself as this customize your own experience, no two playthroughs are ever exactly the same, it's a bit contrarian to declare that the player has absolutely no independent agency over what maps they want to play. You can pick what map you want to start on, which in theory should be a nice consolation prize, but it's not, because it doesn't really in any meaningful way, shape, or form address the wider problem. Technically, in the strictest, most literal definition, you could make the case that Back 4 Blood does allow you to play your own way, provided you do so within the very narrow framework they created. It'd be like if you were a child, provided at least some of you actually had childhoods and you didn't just burst into being as an adult like the Trunchbull in Matilda. You might remember playing in those small outdoor sandboxes with those handful of toys that, like that plastic mold that allowed you, at least in theory, to make a sandcastle, or the shovel and bucket, which both always seem to be at least partially broken. There might be a few more, but I don't really feel like spending minutes more on this analogy. Well, imagine the grown-up monitoring you took away your shovel, took away your bucket, your sandcastle maker, all of it, and left you literally a single plastic spork and told you to have fun. Technically, if you're employing a literal definition, you could argue that in this sandbox you can still play your own way, since there's no strictly defined limit to what you could or couldn't do to entertain yourself with this KFC spork. It'd be a stupid and disingenuous argument to make, but you could certainly make it. I don't think it would be hyperbole to say that I feel very similarly about Back 4 Blood. When I initially did a first impressions video on Back 4 Blood's pre-launch beta, I expressed concern over how many or how few levels would be included in the launch version of the game, and whether that number would validate the presumed $60 retail price tag. Also, I was disappointed with the lackluster amount of lore delivered in those preview versions of the levels we ultimately got. Also, given how there were only 2 maps featured in the beta and a limited number of cards available to unlock during said beta, the developers didn't exactly put their best foot forward with this game. Luckily, I'm relatively happy to report that these concerns were more or less laid to rest when I got the opportunity to do a full playthrough. As I illustrated earlier, Back 4 Blood currently contains 4 campaigns in the base game. I say base game specifically because if you bought one of the more expensive versions of the game, you would have gotten access to the Back 4 Blood Season Pass, which will eventually include access to multiple additional campaigns, characters, and other gameplay impacting content. I'm hopeful that Turtle Rock will also make these additional Season Pass campaigns available as individual paid DLC around the same time they become available to Season Pass owners. I expect there will be probably some kind of exclusive Season Pass only early unlock, allowing Season Pass holders to access to content before the general public, because timed exclusivity for higher tier collector's edition owners seems to now be one of the newer forms of FOMO that AAA publishers seem intent on exploiting. We already know that the first DLC campaign, Tunnels of Terror, appears to be aiming for release sometime in Q1 2022, with 2 additional DLC campaigns set to release later in that year. It's a little disconcerting to observe that paying $60 for the game only grants you access to basically half of the total developed amount of content. It's a slightly sleazy move on Turtle Rock's part, but part of me strongly suspects that this was the trade-off they made with the publisher, Warner Bros., in exchange for not monetizing the cards and card deck system. But getting back to what we do have, Back 4 Blood currently features 29 levels spread out over the aforementioned 4 campaigns. Each level takes roughly 15 to 20 minutes to complete, although there can be a certain amount of variance there. I've completed certain levels in less than 10 minutes easily, so it really comes down to how aggressively you play and, of course, the combined difficulty of whatever cards the AI draws at the start of that round. It took me a little less than 10 hours in total to play through the whole game, but I had to restart a couple times, so that slowed me up. I've seen other estimates range from 11 hours to 18 hours. Personally, I have no idea what would cause players to take up 18 hours to complete this game, unless you absolutely suck at clicking on zombies with your mouse, because when you take away the shooting and positioning, the actual levels are fairly linear. There's some room occasionally for sidetracking, like the occasional supply room, but not much. Let's put it this way, there's about as much opportunity for sidetracking here as there would be in an Overwatch competitive map. The point is, though, while I resent the game being sliced and diced for Season Pass purposes, I do have to give Turtle Rock credit for at least providing a passable playthrough length for the full game. It may not be as good a value proposition as Left 4 Dead's 6 hours of content for only $10, but it's still better than a lot of AAA $60 games generally offer these days, which admittedly isn't a very high bar to surpass. Speaking of admittedly not very high bars to surpass, let's talk about the in-game bot AIs controlling your teammate characters. If you, like me, and probably most of our players of Back 4 Blood, likely had to experience extensively, almost always to our detriment, the friendly AI program is the one area that Turtle Rock not only failed to take a leap forward, but takes so many steps back, it should be considered an industry-wide embarrassment. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to play this game solo, or ideally with less than 4 players. I almost feel like it would have been better just to give us the option to play with 2 or 3 human players rather than let the game's AI players join the match. The bots are just unbelievably dreadful. If you're trying to sneak past birds or cars or anything else that could set off an alarm if disturbed, you better hope that there isn't a single zombie in that area, because if there is, your AI teammates are going to go full Rambo and set off every bloody alarm within your immediate radius, drowning the whole team in a horde of zombies that otherwise would have been easily avoidable. And dear God, never ever put yourself in a position where the bots have to rescue you. Never do that. I mean, sometimes it's unavoidable, but what are you going to do? The bots would gladly stand around your dying body, seemingly daydreaming about playing Half-Life 3 or something, as your character screams at the top of their lungs for help, rather than actually help you out. The number of times I failed around because I got downed once, and the bots just refused to do anything other than stand over me, would astound you.
A few moments later.
Something is different. Move! Keep going! Ah! How could this happen?
What were they thinking with this shitload of fuck?
It happened on at least 6 or 7 occasions, although luckily, in at least a few of those cases, I had at least one other human player to help me up. Also, weirdly enough, the AI doesn't seem to ever pick up weapons found in the level. And while you definitely don't want your AI teammates just scooping up all the best weapons and attachments intended for the player, the reality that you'll inevitably soon be facing multiple zombie hordes dictates that you have more than just one melee or secondary weapon on hand, which is seemingly all that the AI players seem to carry. Just one primary or a secondary weapon, which they carry from the beginning of the level to the end, never swapping off. No wonder they almost always end up dying or perpetually being at low health. They never pick up bandages or first aid kits, so you're forced to carry that kind of thing for them because seemingly you're the only one allowed to have 2 medical items on hand at any given time. So you end up having to choose between often healing yourself or healing yourself and one other teammate because let's face it, you're not going to give up both your healing items to heal your AI teammates. The point is, when you have very intelligent enemy AI, but conversely also very stupid and dangerously unhelpful friendly AI that refuses to carry any items, won't pick up downed players, and has no map awareness at all, your friendly AI becomes a literal detriment to the team and actively works against the likelihood of your success. Speaking to the individual campaign levels, there weren't many that struck me as, per se, especially memorable, at least not due to their level design. The cards can admittedly make anything interesting in a really good or really bad way, but as for the levels themselves, there were only a few that struck me as really interesting. The Handyman was one such level where the game expanded upon a mechanic introduced in a previous level where the players have to destroy the heart of this diseased, cancerous-looking biomass, but simply shooting it or meleeing it won't do anything. Instead, the player has to look down and follow these individual illuminated, fleshy tentacle things back to their smaller auxiliary hearts and pop them as you would an overly large pus-filled pimple. Disgusting, yet oftentimes equally satisfying. I also had a really good time in that one level where you have to hold out, Call of Duty zombie style, in the small local bar where zombies pour in from every open door, window, and crevice imaginable, while the jukebox blasts redneck music in your ear. Nothing like having your own Kingsman Church scene set in this bar set piece, set to the tune of great song picks I've honestly never heard before, like Black Betty. Unfortunately for me and my playthrough partner, Black Betty ultimately became more of a curse than a blessing.
I never even attempted the hardest difficulty. I tried it, well, I tried it one time, we died on the first mission with a bunch of randoms. I was like...
No, I want to trust an idiot like you on the hardest difficulty.
Oh, okay. We'll see who alerts the first fucking
I wouldn't even
crow.
trust you on intermediate.
We'll see who alerts the first crow.
Notice I've not died this whole time. Wait, did the game just lag out?
It has. I hear nothing but redneck music right now. Do you hear redneck music?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here. Yeah, I'm hearing it too.
I opened up the door. I opened up this door and all I hear is dun 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 dun.
That's what I'm hearing too.
Black Betty!
Oh my god, what the hell? I criticize most of the levels for being somewhat forgettable, but to the game's credit, there weren't ever levels that I honestly felt were bad from a design perspective. They all played at least somewhat differently from one another, but I did feel visually that the Turtle Rock team could have done a somewhat better job giving each map a bit more visual flair. As much as I enjoy generic town and back alley levels, from a gameplay perspective, alternating between open spaces and narrowed corridors, most of the maps just visually don't stick out from one another. You trade one cool blue shadowed evening or night map for another cool blue evening or night map. I don't know if Turtle Rock just wasn't given enough time on designing the actual levels. I just can't see the overwhelming majority of these maps even coming close to the amount of attention to detail the Left 4 Dead games had in the maps. And as a result, I don't think any of these maps are going to receive the same level of community love that some of the Left 4 Dead maps have received. And yes, I know technically Valve made Left 4 Dead 2, but Turtle Rock did contribute a free DLC campaign for Left 4 Dead 2, and they did make Left 4 Dead 1, so I don't think it would be a stretch to say that Turtle Rock should have picked up some additional lessons on art design from their time collaborating with Valve. Even Evolve had more going for it in some areas of their art design. What I don't understand is how in many ways people give studios like Turtle Rock a pass when they don't deliver in one minor area or another, like having somewhat generic visuals, but when a far smaller AA or indie team like say the developers of Terminator Resistance do the same, they get an overwhelming abundance of criticism from both gaming news or review outlets and average players in Steam reviews or on forums. Do I think the visuals here are garbage? No. No, I do not. Are there areas where I think they tend to be rather samey, causing you, the player, to frequently not clearly distinguish one level from the next? Yeah, I don't think it would be an unfair assessment to say that would be a valid criticism. Now, when I'm talking about visuals, I'm specifically only referring to the background stuff, environmental models and assets, that kind of thing. The actual player models, as well as the models for the Ridden, aka the zombies, are excellent. There's lots of detail and they all maintain a very clean but memorable design. The bosses especially are wonderful, with designs that are both very arcadey, almost cartoony, while simultaneously being quite intimidating, to be honest. Speaking of the bosses, since they are one of the most promoted features of Back 4 Blood, There is actually a decent variety of them. I was a bit concerned when all we saw prior to release was one single boss, the Ogre, and while it was visually interesting to look at, it was more or less a living embodiment of that typical giant kaiju slow-moving monster trope. Also, as a boss to fight against, it is stupidly easy to counter. All you have to do is just sit behind some kind of partial cover, leaving yourself just exposed enough for the monster to try to attack you, but also covered enough where no melee swipe or long-range splash projectile is ever going to hit you. I do not know if this was the intended playstyle, I rather doubt it, as this does feel like a borderline exploit taking advantage of the Ogre's rather limited AI, but I can't say that I feel all that bad, given how much damage you have to deal in order to eliminate a boss. I should note that if you try hiding behind cover fairly close to the Ogre, he can grab you, so he does have at least some means of taking action when the player is behind cover, but in order for this to work, you have to be hiding behind a fairly exposed piece of cover, or just outright exposed. I wish the developers expanded upon the boss AI just a little bit more to be a bit more adaptive. In terms of quality, I don't think anyone's expecting alien isolation levels of cleverly manufactured artificial intelligence, but sometimes the Ogre isn't even as smart as my old Android smartphone, and believe me, that's saying something. Oh boy. The Hag is another monster that technically is a boss, but it's so lacking in any form of gravitas that I think anyone would be more than justified in considering it barely more than an elite enemy. Similar to the Bruiser, but just a bit tankier and comparatively less fun to play against. I've never been a big fan of enemies that automatically stun or disable the player through inescapable means, and that's exactly what the Hag does as it grabs you and begins swallowing you alive. Since this is the internet and thus a certain percentage of people on it seem to have an inexplicable fetish for being eaten alive, perhaps it'll dissuade you that the creature devouring you isn't some kind of beautiful vor-obsessed enchantress, but a fleshy mass with legs that looks like something too hideous for even Netflix to put in Stranger Things. And since it doesn't have a health bar, you really have no idea how much damage you're doing to it. And since it doesn't have a cool eye-catching entrance like the Ogre, for instance, I honestly have no idea why so many people and articles online keep citing it as a boss. It's easily the weakest and most underwhelming boss by far, but still just a tiny bit stronger than most enemy types. It really makes me think that Back 4 Blood should have strengthened the differences between special ridden and bosses. For me, if I'm in a party of 4 players and we can't kill whatever it is within 10 seconds of combined focus fire, but we can still kill it within a minute without taking much damage as a group, it's neither a boss nor a normal enemy, but something in between. And I know you could argue it's a special infected type monster, so that counts as an in-between type already, but exploders and snitchers are both counted as special infected type classes here, and they're both comparatively very easy to take out. Any way you slice it, there's no scenario where the Hag feels like it fits in compared to the rest of the enemy roster. The final boss is where I feel the game really goes off the rails, the Abomination. I don't think it would be an excessive indulgence of hyperbole to say that this final boss fight was only a few steps short of an Abomination itself. It was by far the most boring and half-assed level in the entire game, which is made worse when you take into consideration the fact that it was preempted by a modestly lengthy cutscene showing you how seemingly overpowered and scary it was. The entire boss fight feels excessively scripted, which is saying quite a lot for a game that already at times feels quite scripted already. There is nothing dynamic about it. The boss just attacks in the same exact pattern every single time with no deviation, and you don't get all that much in terms of visual feedback to make you feel like you're having really any impact on the boss throughout the duration of the fight. You just don't feel like there's any meaningful stakes in the actual gameplay, which is contrasted by the stakes originally set in the cinematic that preceded it. Just a few minutes ago, I verbally berated the Hag for being a annoying boss-type monster to fight, but I'll take the Hag and all its annoyances over the boringly scripted boss. Instead of ending with a bang, Back 4 Blood in my opinion ends with something more along the lines of a whimper with that final boss. I mentioned cutscenes a minute ago, and yes, this game does have quite a few of them, at least technically. Most of them amount to more or less nothing. You get a few back and forth quips between the characters, but generally the cutscenes only exist to provide at least a superficial explanation for how the characters get from location A to location B and so on. I'm not one to necessarily want excessively lengthy cutscenes, like the infamously long cutscenes of Metal Gear Solid 5, and in a multiplayer setting, I do feel it's even more important to keep things tight, because in almost all multiplayer games, the players just want to get to the action, and most cutscenes in most kinds of cooperative games don't generally give the player much of a reason to give a damn, all things considered. But I do believe there is and should be a middle ground between those two extremes. Flesh out your characters a bit, use those cutscenes to show and tell would otherwise be irrelevant information during the actual level, and to a lesser extent, show off other areas of the world that we haven't seen yet. Give people a better understanding of how massive the stakes are, because as far as gameplay has shown us, this zombie apocalypse seems exclusively confined to just a handful of towns and cities we've explored. And unless you're very bad at delivering information in your narrative, you shouldn't need too long a cutscene to do it. Most of the cutscenes here range from 15 to 30 seconds in length. Imagine how much more you could do with 60 or 90 seconds. I played enough of Back 4 Blood where I can tell you with great certainty that in the vast majority of instances, it'll take easily 60 or 90 seconds for all 4 players to finish connecting to the server. I've spent up to several minutes at a time waiting for the full team to join so the resupply store would open, which it only does when everyone's connected. Making those cutscenes longer would have little to no impact on how long it takes to start a match, especially since the cutscenes are already skippable. That said, let's move on to corrupted cards. Near the start of the video, I briefly touched on how the AI draws its own cards to counter whatever net benefits the player drew from their hand, and in doing so make your conflict an even more tedious one. Like the player cards, written cards can be very hit or miss in terms of the degree to which they'll have any impact on that round. Corrupted cards come in 4 basic varieties: Common Infected, Special Infected, Boss Infected, and Environment. I'm not going to go over what most of the individual cards look like or do, since it's all pretty straightforward and simple. Most of these special infected cards just result in the game spawning in double or triple the usual amount of one specific type of enemy, like the Tall Boy or the Exploder, which can be annoying but isn't really that innovative from a gameplay perspective. The boss infected cards more or less just guarantee that you'll have to fight off at least one boss at some point in that match. You can find yourself in the unfortunate position of fighting multiple bosses, however. I've only had that happen to me a few times during my time in the game, but I'll tell you, I've never walked away with no injuries whatsoever. You'll almost always get bloodied and more often than not killed if you have to fight more than one boss at a time. It takes a very well-coordinated team to survive such an attack. The only 2 categories of corrupted cards I found even remotely interesting in terms of shaking up the gameplay were the Common Infected and Environment cards. Since the overwhelming majority of the time you spend in a match is spent fighting off hordes of Common Infected, and what kinds of environment cards you're dealt will determine the visibility of targets and also impacts your access to certain rooms and objectives. My 2 favorite Common Infected cards are the Shard Ridden and Blighted Ridden. Shard Ridden explode upon headshots, dealing a limited amount of AoE damage in a very small 360-degree radius, although this can be multiplied if there are other Shard Ridden within the radius of the first. Blighted Ridden dissolve into pools of acid upon dying, which will remain on the ground for several seconds, causing damage to the player if they happen to step on the acid pool. Going up against either of these Ridden types will force you to change up your tactic, as you can avoid taking explosive damage from Shard Ridden by shooting them anywhere but the head, and as for the Blighted, as long as you're not relying on melee, but have a loadout more oriented for mid to long range damage output, you'll be fine. Moving over to the environment cards, there's very few currently, but of the ones that I've seen so far, there's not a single one I dislike. You've got Gloom and Darkness, which I've seen paired together most often, which when combined results in you being in near or complete darkness, save for your own flashlights, because power is out throughout the map. There's also a Mist card, which does exactly what you think it does, and covers the whole map in mist, making it hard to see more than 10 feet in front of you at any given time. Mist functions more or less as gloom, except that it appears to have no impact whatsoever on power. And of course you have the birds. While I'm pretty sure none of you watching will have any deep-rooted fear of birds, the birds here in Back 4 Blood will rapidly instill in you a strong, almost Hitchcockian fear or disdain of birds, as these birds can oftentimes, as I've indicated earlier, be a strong determining factor in your potential demise, especially if you have bots in your team that are willing to trip the birds. They're not really that hard to avoid, but if you do happen to make noise near them, you better run like hell or find a place to hunker down to survive the inevitable horde. I mention all this because these, especially the birds, are interesting modifiers and will influence the tactics you as a team will need to employ if you want to get to the next safe room alive. This is not a game where a single universal one-shoot-fits-all approach of just running and gunning without thought will prevail, especially not if you're playing at one of the higher difficulty levels. Back 4 Blood may ultimately fall short of the difficulty of some cooperative FPS games like the GTFO, where even a single mistake could be the difference between success and failure, but it's about as challenging as a cooperative FPS game with casual players in mind can realistically be, without setting the bar too unreasonably high for newcomers. I should probably mention that the main form of progression in Back 4 Blood, beyond just merely playing through the campaign levels in a linear fashion, is by unlocking additional cards to add to your custom deck. You unlock these by earning points for completing campaign levels, as well as completing any additional side objectives you might have been tasked with. These points, which thankfully can only be earned by playing and replaying the levels, can be spent on a variety of different themed card decks, each seemingly named after a location in the world. Similar to skill tree branches, you can progress through each of them, and upon completing one or more of them, that card branch, if you will disappear and a new one will take its place. Each set of unlockable cards usually share a similar purpose, albeit in different ways. You have card sets more oriented to increasing your efficiency with certain mid or long range weapons, as well as others that alternatively make you a better melee fighter, and others that provide equally useful but more passive oriented benefits. As for me personally, I chose to build myself a deck that centered strongly around survivability, with most of the cards providing either additional health, lifesteal abilities, increased effectiveness of healing items, and instant health boost for the entire team if one member becomes incapacitated or killed. That said, I also tossed in a few cards increasing my movement speed and stamina, because as one might imagine, being able to run fast and keep running can both be critical components in surviving a horde of zombies nipping at your heels. At one point, I think I upgraded my stamina card 6 or 7 times, bringing my stamina up to 150 or 160%, I think, compared to the 100% it was to begin with. All in all, it really helped solidify my power fantasy of just mowing down zombies as they ran at us, only to then hack and slash at them without restraint once they got within range. Because using melee weapons at close range does use up stamina in your bar, so you can't run and stab at the same time. Well, I mean, you could, but not for long. One would think with such powerful cards, the levels must be a breeze to walk through, but oh no, they're not. As anyone familiar with Left 4 Dead 1 or 2 can tell you, the AI Director is an AI system designed to ensure each playthrough is unique, and ensure there is never too much downtime between scripted sequences. And if a group of players is making their way through a level too easily, not losing a lot of health or ammo, etc., the AI Director will go beyond just drawing negative cards and will make zombie waves larger or spawn in more elite enemies, etc., all designed to wear you down and give you a challenge. While overall I'd probably describe my outlook on the card system implementation here to be relatively positive, albeit sometimes erring on the side of overall indifference, there is one area that does aggravate me moderately, and that is the fact that the developers, for reasons beyond my meager understanding, decided to exclusively wall off all cosmetic items behind the unlocking of certain cards. And the worst bit is you don't even get to pick what cosmetics you want to unlock. The card unlock tree follows this basic formula. Unlock 3 or 4 cards, unlock a single spray halfway through, and then revert back to being forced to unlock more cards, before then getting an opportunity to unlock a single certain character or weapon skin. Instead of allowing players to unlock whatever cosmetics they want in whatever order they please, in order to allow them to more fully embrace whatever character they've chosen as their preferred persona, thereby following the game's supposed theme of playing your own way, you're mandated to waste your earned points on nonsense that you never wanted to spend it on, just to be able to unlock whatever weapon or character skins the developers have predetermined is the one you should have at that precise moment. It takes away all player agency, any and all substantial player choice, and replaces it with the illusion of choice. Like for me, I enjoy playing as Mom, the grizzled older combatant, whose most noteworthy characteristic, aside from wielding a very fun-to-use sawed-off shotgun, is her very dry sense of humor, sometimes offset by a more serious, trauma-influenced mood. Her lines, like most of the dialogue in the game, is all very well written, and the voice acting likewise is fairly solid. The problem is, after over 20 hours of grinding through Back 4 Blood's various campaigns and unlocking a hell of a lot of points, all of which I put towards completing as many of the unlockable cards and cosmetics in the linear order the game grants them to me, never once have I unlocked a single character or weapon cosmetic for Mom. Having cards be unlocked the way they are makes perfect sense to me. Organizing cards and unlockable lists themed generally around the card's perks is a good way of allowing players to more easily figure out which areas of their deck they want to strengthen at the expense of others. But why not implement a separate unlock system for weapon and character cosmetic unlocks? There's literally an NPC vendor in your camp that has a whole ton of different skinned weapons and other stuff. Here you can still change out whatever cosmetics you have unlocked, but you have to unlock them in the first place. There's no doubt in my mind that at one point or another the developers had intended to have some kind of separate interface for cosmetic unlocks, but for whatever reason abandoned the concept. Likewise, the entire camp hub idea was clearly one the developers had intended to do something with. For a camp that appears from a preliminary glance to be rather enormous in size, very little of it is actually accessible. Invisible walls are everywhere. The only things you have access to are the bare bones things that you need in order to at least partially prepare you for what's waiting out there for you. There's a ton of NPCs, but you're unable to talk to them, let alone develop personal relationships with them, or even just accept optional side quests from them. Most of them just linger in the background awkwardly behind the invisible walls. I criticized this in the beta, but I figured at the time that maybe it was just because it was beta. No, the developers weren't restricting full access to the camp because it was beta. It was because the full game itself didn't have anything more substantial to offer. One could even argue as a result, there was really no purpose for this hub even existing. You could have easily had the players spawn in a smaller underground bunker with the same gun range and armory we got in the current hub. It would have made just as much sense within the lore to do that as it did this, and it would have been far more optimal for players in terms of conserving the CPU and GPU performance. One of my comparatively smaller complaints, but an equally noteworthy one, is that Back 4 Blood from a purely technical perspective is very prone to unexpectedly crashing or producing some honestly hilarious bugs. This happened probably at least half a dozen times during my time spent in the game, and while I didn't record every single bug or crash I encountered, I did manage to get footage of some of my favorite moments, thanks to my new friend and content creator, Bidufsama, whose name I'm hoping I'm pronouncing correctly, but honestly I don't give a shit, so we're going with it anyway. I'll throw a link to his Twitch stream down below, as he did stream us playing together for several hours a few days after the game initially launched. Honestly, I don't even have words to describe what happened. Check out this clip for yourself.
One of our buddies.
Around the corner, big boy.
When you say big boy, is it like ogre big? Oh!
That's the big boy I was talking about.
Who just got hit by that? They're gone off my screen. Someone was standing next to the big boy, or like was standing.
Yeah,
on the
I was
truck
on top of the truck. I was on top of the truck,
Yeah,
and I got
yeah,
blown all the way away. Technical bugs and server crashes aren't the end of the world for a highly anticipated AAA game, but given how the game had already been delayed once, supposedly so the developers would have a few extra months to focus on optimizing and polishing the game for a smooth day one launch, I have to wonder how much buggier the game would have been had it released back in June instead of October, because even with the advantage of 4 extra months dedicated to nothing other than polish and optimize, Back 4 Blood during its first few weeks definitely was not a smooth experience. I think one of the biggest problems with Back 4 Blood is one that most people, as far as I have seen and heard, haven't really discussed, and that's the fact that the preemptive expectations from the more diehard Left 4 Dead fans were so astronomically high that realistically there was no way in hell the game could come close to meeting them. And I think in large part this was due to how certain content creators, especially those with a history of covering Valve-related products like Left 4 Dead, went out of their way to position Back 4 Blood as this true second coming of the true Left 4 Dead experience, putting the developers under an unbelievable amount of pressure to deliver a game that was at least as good, if not better, than one of the most revered co-op shooter titles of all time. I think if 2020 and 2021 have shown us anything, it's that overhyping a game to the point of diluted theocratic fanaticism will almost certainly result in the final product under-delivering, at least to some extent, because you've essentially allowed no possible wiggle room for error. I don't think there's anything wrong with being excited for a game release, but there's a line in the sand that, for your own good, I think we should all be mindful not to cross. I do look forward to seeing what the developers have in store for players going into 2022, as they do have a pretty solid foundation already, but it's up to them to take it from there. Before I wrap this up for today, I do want to underline an important caveat, in that while I've dedicated an extraordinary amount of time to critiquing the many surface-level and underlining elements that comprise Back 4 Blood, this review isn't meant to be an all-in-one guide to the game. There are several specific things that I deliberately did not cover here because I do not feel they are relevant points of discussion that might sway someone on the fence as to whether or not to buy the game. And at the end of the day, it's that question of whether the game being reviewed is a game worth buying that I'm here to answer. Overall, do I recommend this game? As you might have already surmised by what I've already said, I think it depends greatly on what you're expecting from it. If you're expecting this to be a fully unapologetic natural successor to Left 4 Dead, I honestly don't believe that's what you're getting here. There are a lot of other more authentic follow-up to the Left 4 Dead franchise. I would personally recommend Warhammer Vermintide 1 and 2 if you're looking for that classic arcadey, mindless Left 4 Dead fun, albeit with a dark fantasy aesthetic added to the mix, which in my opinion only makes it better. But if you're looking for a game that evolves, no pun intended, the Left 4 Dead formula, and shifts it away from casual play into a slightly more hardcore direction, where you have to constantly keep mental track of cards and to a certain degree base your playstyle over what is or isn't considered meta, dictated in part to how the developers continue rebalancing the game post-launch, similar to the mentality that Overwatch players have to adapt. If that's not something that appeals to you, then I can't really imagine Back 4 Blood being something that you're going to enjoy sticking with once you get past that initial appeal. I know that's not a simple yes or no answer, but sometimes clean-cut yes or no answers aren't always a possibility. I'm very mindful of the fact that likely many of you watching will have different preferred playstyles. Some of you prefer games that require a lot of tactical awareness and complex mechanics, while some of you conversely prefer to just mindlessly play to unwind at the end of a long day. Back 4 Blood, in my opinion, sits directly on that fine line in the sand between those two groups. Not exclusively designed for highbrow, metagame-obsessed diehards, and conversely nowhere near as casual as Left 4 Dead was. Also, I'm kind of happy to see that Turtle Rock is back on solid footing. They're a well-respected developer that unfortunately just never seemed to find their footing after separating from Valve. Hopefully the success of Back 4 Blood is prodigious enough that it opens the gateway for potentially future installments in the Back 4 Blood franchise. Only time will tell. My best advice is to wait for a decent sale. Add it to your Steam wishlist and wait. That said though, if you have any specific questions that I've not addressed in this video today, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I promise you I will respond to you as soon as possible. I always try to make an effort to respond to the stuff you guys post. You know what, I don't normally do this, but I want to see how many of you made it to the end of this video here, since this was a very long video. If you did, I want you to type this bit of dialogue in a comment down below.
Whoops, you have to put the CD in your computer.
And the first person to do it will get their comment pinned at the top. Have fun. On that note though, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the work I do in the channel, subscribing and clicking the bell to opt into getting notifications really does help. That said, thank you of course to those of you that have already done so. I have not forgotten you and I appreciate your support every day. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe and peace out.